So, prom, as in junior prom, senior prom, the big dance, right? If you're in high school and you want to go to the big dance with somebody else as your date, you have to decide on your strategy. Are you going to wait to be asked, or are you going to seize the initiative and do the asking yourself? In the closest thing that we have to prom in American politics, it turns out that Democrats and Republicans approach prom strategy very differently. Because in the Republican Party, today was the deadline that the party set for various cities across the country to ask Reince Priebus to go to the prom. Today was the deadline by which cities had to submit their bids, their proposals, to host the next presidential nominating convention for the Republican Party. So remember, in 2012, the Republicans held their nominating convention in Tampa. Remember, it had to be cut short a day because of the hurricane, and they'd written, "We built it," on the wall of the convention, and nobody could quite remember what that was about. The time before that, 2008, it was in St. Paul, Minnesota. That was a fun one. I had a good time at that one. This year, today was the deadline, and these are the cities that have applied to host the Republican National Convention. For the Democratic Party, though, they are approaching this process completely differently. The Democrats are not waiting to be asked by cities around the country. No, Democratic Party Chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz is instead herself doing the asking. On behalf of the Democratic Party, the chair has sent letters to all of these cities asking if they would please consider hosting the Democrats for their presidential nominating convention in 2016. I think we've got the list here. Yeah. The Democrats' list includes all of the cities that applied for the Republican convention, except for Denver, because Denver hosted the Democrats in 2008. Nobody knows if these cities that the Democrats are offering themselves to will actually respond to the letter and try to get the convention. Nobody knows if they're even interested in hosting the Democratic convention. So that's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. But it's an interesting sort of anthropomorphic insight into the way the two different parties approach issues like this in terms of waiting to be asked versus taking the initiative and doing the asking themselves. On the Republican side, we do know who wants the Republican convention next time around. It's one city each from Texas, Arizona, Missouri, Nevada, and Colorado, but also 3 cities from the same state. 3 cities from one state all competing against each other to get the same convention. Cincinnati, Ohio, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio are all applying overtly to please try to get the Republican convention for 2016. And any city in Ohio, or maybe every city in Ohio, has to think that they've got a pretty good chance at getting the RNC, right? As Cleveland points out in their application to host the convention, as goes Ohio, so goes the nation, right? Ohio has become the prototypical presidential swing state. Ohio is basically split down the middle politically. It's absolutely a presidential bellwether. In 2004, Ohio went for George W. Bush by 2 points. He won the presidency. In 2008, the state went for Barack Obama by 5 points. He won the presidency. In 2012, the state went for Barack Obama by 2 points, and he won the presidency. And that pattern holds all the way back to 1960. The last time Ohio picked somebody who didn't go on to be the winner of the general election was when Ohio just loved Richard Nixon too much. But because Ohio is such a bellwether, and because it's always so close there, Ohio has ended up being really, really important in election years. And that's not just because of how they vote in terms of who they vote for. It's also become important how Ohio votes literally, how they go to the polls, whether or not they find it easy or difficult to cast their very, very important votes. How Ohio votes matters to the nation. And in 2004, the way Ohio voted was a disaster, particularly in densely populated parts of Ohio, which of course tend to lean heavily Democratic. It was a disaster in 2004. People waited in line for 7 hours, 8, 9 hours, all night long in order to cast a vote. Voting lines stretching not just out the door in Ohio, but down the block and around the corner. The voting rules, of course, say if you're in line before the polls close, the polls have to stay open until you've made your way through the line and you've cast your vote. So in Ohio in 2004, the polls stayed open way into the night, while Ohio's monstrously poor voting lines inched forward. Some people were still voting in Ohio at 4 a.m. on Election Day in 2004. And it was a close outcome in Ohio that year. And, you know, it's easy to see the heroism, the civic heroism of people who stayed online for 9 hours, who stayed online until 4 in the morning and stood out there in the cold in order to cast their vote. But by definition of the word hero, not everybody can be a hero. And the estimates of how many votes were not cast in Ohio that year because of voting problems, those estimates were devastating. 175,000 people are thought to have gone home that year in that one state after trying to vote but failing to because the voting lines were so terrible and they didn't have 9 hours to spend. And George W. Bush squeaked by in that state by 2 points and he won re-election. His margin of victory in Ohio was 120,000 votes, after 175,000 people in the state looked at the lines and decided they couldn't take it. Significantly less than the number of people who went home rather than stay in those lines was the margin of victory for George W. Bush that year. After that voting disaster in 2004, Ohio kind of tried to get its act together a little bit. They didn't, I think, want that kind of embarrassment again. Between that presidential election, 2004, and the next one in 2008, one of the ways that Ohio tried to fix its third world caliber election system was by just giving people more time to vote than just on Election Day. They expanded early voting. And the early voting expansion specifically included the very popular weekend before the election. And so 2008 rolled around, and yeah, there were still lines in Ohio, and people did still have to do some work to vote, particularly in densely populated places, but on the whole, it was much, much better. On the last weekend before the election alone, that Saturday and Sunday, more than 90,000 Ohio votes were cast just in that election day, just on that weekend before Election Day. And you know, you'd think that early voting would be a relatively non-controversial thing. It's not like the kind of fights we have over what sort of documentation, what papers you have to show in order to be able to vote, or the professed Republican worries about who's allowed to vote and how you prove that you're allowed to vote. Early voting doesn't invoke any of those concerns at all. Early voting is just about when you turn up, right? And people like having more options about when to vote than just Election Day. By 2012, by the next presidential election in Ohio, fully a third of the people who voted in that election in 2012 voted early. A third of the state voted early. People like it. It's convenient to be able to vote early. But that almost didn't happen in 2012 because smooth, convenient voting processes do have the nasty side effect of making voting kind of easy to do. And that has a terrible effect, meaning that a lot of people end up doing it. And any political strategist who you can bribe into telling you the truth will tell you that higher turnout elections tend to benefit Democratic candidates, and lower turnout elections tend to benefit Republican candidates. Republican candidates between the 2008 election and the last election, they got control. They got complete control of the state government in Ohio, the legislature and the governorship. And with that complete Republican control, they did everything they could to try to make voting harder in Ohio for the last presidential election. And they specifically tried to get rid of early voting on the last weekend before Election Day. And they would have gotten away with it, too, if it weren't for those meddling kids. The Obama re-election campaign sued Ohio over them trying to get rid of the last weekend of early voting, you know, when 90,000 people had cast their ballots in the previous election. The Obama campaign sued Ohio over that, and they won their lawsuit in the Supreme Court. The Obama campaign, incidentally, also went on to win Ohio in 2012. And on that last weekend before Election Day, the Cincinnati Enquirer sent a reporter to stake out the early voting site in Cincinnati for that all-important last weekend before the election. And this was his report. This was filed on Monday, November 5th. So that's the day before Election Day, but the day after Ohio had spent that last weekend early voting. And the Cincinnati Enquirer on that day says this, quote, "The first results from election 2012 are in, leaving no doubt about the outcome. Early weekend voting is a big winner." The Enquirer interviewed a 37-year-old single mom who said her weekdays get pretty busy, being a single mom and all. Voting on the weekend would, quote, "probably be her best chance," she said. An 88-year-old man from North Avondale, Ohio, said, quote, "I don't know if I'll have the time on Tuesday." He told the Enquirer, "It's just easier to do things like this on the weekend." But again, Ohio Republicans had tried to get rid of that way of voting for the 2012 election. It was only that victory by the Obama campaign at the Supreme Court that gave Ohioans their chance to vote on the weekend before the election that year. And many voters chose to grab it. It was a fight to vote in Ohio in 2004. In 2008, early voting made it easier. In 2012, it was a fight to hold on to early voting that had made voting easier in Ohio. But now, after the 2012 election, with Republicans in control of Ohio state government, they seem to have found a way to mostly kill early voting. Ohio Secretary of State John Husted announced today that there will be no early voting on Sundays at all, including the Sunday before the election. Sundays, of course, are traditionally when African-American churches do their Souls to the Polls events, where they bus people to go early vote after Sunday services. The Ohio Secretary of State also announced today that there would be no early voting whatsoever on weeknights. So if you were planning on doing your early voting after work, because you can't get time off work to vote and you can't go on that Sunday before the election, well, that will not be available for the next election either. This comes on the heels of 2 new bills to restrict voting that were signed into law last week by Ohio's Republican Governor John Kasich. One of those bills cut a total of 6 days out of the early voting period overall. John Kasich also just eliminated the 1-week period in Ohio where you could register to vote and vote on the same day. That's gone. And they've made it harder to get your provisional ballot counted if you have to cast one of those. And they've made it harder to get your absentee ballot in the first place. And all that comes on the heels of Ohio Republicans voting last year to reduce the number of voting machines that the counties have at the voting sites. Because, yeah, that's definitely been a huge problem, right? Way too many voting machines. A terrible scourge of voting being easy. It must be stopped. Ohio Republicans also voted last year to make it easier to kick people off the rolls. All of these voting rights changes in Ohio last year, last week, and now today, they have all been made on party line 100% Republican votes, or they've been decisions made by 100% Republican officials. And yes, these changes in Ohio matter for Ohio. John Kasich, after all, is up for re-election himself this November. And more people voting would presumably help his Democratic opponent, Ed Fitzgerald, and fewer people voting would presumably help him. So Ohio Republicans making these decisions to make voting harder, this tide of decisions since the last election, yeah, Ohio Republicans are helping themselves. They are making decisions that will affect their own elections, their own ability to hold on to their jobs. But this is Ohio. And when they change the rules by which people vote in that state, it does not end up just affecting Ohio. It ends up affecting all of us.